For decades, migrants from Central America have fled their homes to seek a better life in the United States. Between 1980 and 2013, the population of people in the U.S. born in Central America grew from just around 300,000 to over 3 million. The majority came from a region known as the Northern Triangle, which includes the nations of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. During this time, these nations suffered from economic and political instability, corruption, crime, poverty, and violence. One of the major causes of such strife? The Cold War. From 1947 through 1991, the period now known as the Cold War, the U.S. adopted interventionist foreign policies in an effort to stop the spread of communism. These policies led to the Korean War and the Vietnam War. They also led to U.S. intervention in Central America. The U.S. provided funding, arms, and military training to nations and groups fighting communism, like Guatemala. After World War II, Guatemala was one of the few Latin American countries that operated as a democracy. In 1951, Guatemala democratically elected Jacobo Arbenz, who aimed to fight poverty and inequality by redistributing property more fairly. At the time, 75% of the arable land was controlled by only 2% of the population. One of the largest landowners was an American corporation known as the United Fruit Company, with about 600,000 acres of property. Arbenz's policies would reduce their power and profit. So the U.S. declared these progressive land reforms, as well as Arbenz's legalization of the Communist Party, as a threat to democracy. In 1954, the CIA aided in a military overthrow of the Arbenz government, leading to a civil war in 1960. The war would go on for 36 years. A series of military regimes supported by the U.S. employed death squads, utilized torture, and massacred Mayan villages. Documents declassified in the 1990s revealed the CIA knew about it, but did nothing to stop it. In the end, approximately 200,000 people were killed or disappeared. The Civil War ended in 1996, but the economic, societal, and personal damage would last decades, prompting many to flee the instability and violence for the United States. Guatemala's neighbor El Salvador suffered a similar fate. In the 1980s, El Salvador became embroiled in a civil war, pitting the right-wing military government against Marxist guerrillas. The United States sided with the government, sending billions of dollars in aid as well as military advisors to help the Salvadoran military fight the war. The war, like that in Guatemala, was brutal. In early 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero, the leader of the Catholic Church in El Salvador, wrote a letter to then U.S. President Jimmy Carter, begging him to stop funding the Salvadoran military, which had been terrorizing the Salvadoran people. On March 24, 1980, 1 month after sending the letter, Romero was assassinated while celebrating Mass. The killer had been hired by right-wing military officers. More than 75,000 Salvadorans were killed in the conflict. Students and other revolutionaries were shot, their bodies left on roadsides as warnings. Peasants trying to flee were shot en masse. In one massacre in 1981, as many as 1,200 civilian women, children, and old men were massacred. Once again, documents declassified in the 1990s showed the U.S. was aware of some of these atrocities, but overlooked them for common policy goals. Through the 80s, thousands of Salvadorans fled for their safety. From 1980 to 1990, the Salvadoran immigrant population in the United States increased from 94,000 to 465,000. The war was over by 1992, and with its resolution came a decline in immigration to the U.S., but not an end. A 1990s U.S. policy deported Salvadoran immigrants with criminal records, sending members of LA gangs back to El Salvador, where the gangs took hold and became even more violent. As of 2018, Salvadoran citizens continue to seek asylum in the U.S., as democratic El Salvador still struggles with the corruption, crime, and gang violence set in motion by the decades of conflict. El Salvador's eastern neighbor, Honduras, also suffered in the American war against communism. Under the Reagan administration, the U.S. sought to overthrow the communist Sandinista government in neighboring Nicaragua by supporting the Contras, a right-wing guerrilla rebel force. The U.S. temporarily stationed several hundred American soldiers in Honduras and constructed a number of joint Honduran-U.S. military bases. With the help of the U.S., Honduras soon became a militarized state, creating the conditions for political repression, corruption, and government violence. The U.S. also used its power to push for deregulation of the coffee trade, benefiting U.S. businesses, but ultimately harming Honduras's most vulnerable, its farmers and its poor, sending many fleeing to the U.S. for both economic and safety reasons. The rise in Central Americans immigrating to the U.S., like nearly every large influx of immigrant groups in U.S. history, can be traced back to instability in their home country. For the Irish in the 1840s, it was famine. For the Jews in the early 1900s, it was political oppression and poverty. For the Central Americans, it's a complex story of internal unrest, partially influenced by U.S. intervention during the Cold War. But since the founding of the U.S., immigration has been a central part of the American story, and remains so until this day.